Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet wrapped in a pandemic, which just keeps cascading these unexpected but predictable events, like the president being disclosed as having been infected with COVID, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and now the ramifications of that will spill forward in ways that seem very predictable, perhaps, but contain so much complexity that it's hard to know how to behave sometimes, except for the basics, like vote here in America. That's one of the basics, whatever your stance. This is Andy. I'm Andy Revkin. This is the Sustain What webcast broadcast of the Earth Institute's new initiative on communication and sustainability. And the whole idea is, of this thesis and my initiative is, how do you make information matter when the main means of communicating now are so overloaded, sometimes hijacked, often designed to distract you and divide you rather than to forge progress. I've been at this as a journalist for decades, and I decided the landscape of questions is way too big to fit into a conventional story. So conversations feel like a way to drive things forward. And it's a wonderful day here to have a long-time influence of mine, Thomas Homer-Dixon, who famously wrote a book, 20 years ago, I'm guessing,
Yeah,
The Upside of Down, which, has really, really spun people around at that time and has had several books since then. And now has been working for a long time on a new one, Commanding Hope, which we'll explore in a couple of minutes. Great to have you here from Vancouver Island in the west coast of Canada, where you say the smoke from the California fires is getting in your eyes. It's a global world. Borders are
yes,
meaningless, right?
certainly is.
And Susan Cox Smith, who's a futurist and who helps run futuring trainings and all kinds of work at the Changeist, which is a consultancy and a futurist entity. We'll
Yes.
learn more about. And you have a book out that you were the contributing editor to on futuring, which I can show folks. How to Future, which
Yes.
is something we would all benefit from now. And it isn't always about knowing the future. Maybe often it's not about knowing the future. It's about how do you behave in a way that leaves you open to possibilities and risks. And I reached out to Michael Garfield, who's a young blogger, writer, artist, philosopher, connected with both the Santa Fe Institute, one of my favorite places to go think about complexity, and also with the Long Now Foundation. You'll see some of his blog posts there, and he does a podcast called Future Fossils, which of course we all are, and which resonates with me in the context of the Anthropocene, having been a member of the Anthropocene working group and writing about that idea back in the early 90s. We're laying down a landscape of fossils going forward, carboniferous carbon layer and all kinds of things. And that signature will either be of a positive or something people will look at, or whoever will look at a million or 10 million years from now and go, wow, that was a really screwed up moment in this planet's history. Or they'll look at it and barely see it. And that could either be because we've wiped ourselves out or because we've learned how to live with a smaller footprint. So enough of me. And now let's get to my guests. I'm going to shift the landscape here so we can see everyone a little better. And Thomas, I did want to talk right away about the book and about the concept of kind of shaping hope and energizing it, even at a time, as you articulate, and have articulated, of sort of precipice living. How does that happen? And I could show a slide. I'm going to show an image that kind of conveys the basic thesis of the book. But you could start in right now by saying what brought you from your early conceptions to where you are right now, and then I'll show people a relevant image. Oh, here we go. I just showed that.
Sure, Andy. So my two earlier books, one of which you mentioned, The Upside of Down, the book The Ingenuity Gap, and the book The Upside of Down, were both highly diagnostic. They were books intended to sort of unpack the mechanisms for the crises that we face on the planet right now. And The Upside of Down was finished in 2006, so not quite 20 years ago. The third book, I always intended to do three books, and this third one was supposed to be prescriptive. And inevitably, good prescription is way harder than good diagnosis. I started the book three times. Twice I threw out tens of thousands of words. I started in 2012. So it took me almost 8 years to write. I realized that around 2016, after I'd jettisoned the second batch of paper, that I needed to write it for my children, who are now 15 and 12, Ben, who's 15, and Kate, who's 12. And that the thing that gave me the most personal anguish and that I needed to address was the possibility that they would lose hope in the future as they emerged as adults into what is liable to be an extraordinarily turbulent period, possibly a period marked by enormous violence. And what is it that they can hang on to in terms of a positive vision of the future and motivating principles in their lives that would allow them to continue to have hope? Because I had this epiphany at one point while I was standing on the cliff overlooking the sea here on Vancouver Island, that if they lost hope, then truly all would be lost in the future. That without hope, then we just don't have the motivation really to fix the problems that we face, and we'll fall apart divided and probably engage in enormous violence among each other around the planet. So that was the starting point, and unfortunately, hope has a bad rap in the current discourse. It's regarded as a passive, perhaps a naive emotion, a distraction, something that inclines us to wishful thinking. And so the book is really intended to rejuvenate the idea and create a new concept of hope that can allow us to push through the challenges we face, not just us, but our children too.
And you do lay out, as I'll show here from the introduction to the book, you have these 3 points. Maybe I'll just show them again, and then we'll get back to the discussion. So hold on 1 second while I do that. You say we need to better understand first how we see the world the way we do. In other words, self-awareness, self-perception, sort of Daniel Kahneman thinking fast and slow,
Right.
Stepping back from your own thinking, your own emotions. Cultural cognition, that whole body of knowledge that Dan Kahane has built around work,
Yes.
showing our filters. Number 2, we need to actively create together, from our diverse perspectives, a shared story of a positive future. And that resonates for me because it gets to this other work that folks here at Columbia they run a difficult conversations laboratory. This is Peter Coleman and others, where they're talking about situations of intractable conflict, where you'll never agree on X, Y, and Z, but you have to work with each other in some way or other. So it's not like solving a problem, and it's not like coming to agreement even. It's different than that. So is that a key part of that?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. I'm just about to write to Peter Coleman to connect my research institute with his work. He's, of course, a pioneer in the application of complex systems thinking to conflict resolution. I don't argue that we can find some kind of perfect agreement or resolution of our differences, but we're in an extraordinary situation of shared fate on this planet now. We're either going to live together or we're going to die together. I'm asked by people frequently, where can I go? Where can I go to get away from the impending chaos? Where can I go to escape from climate change? And my answer is actually nowhere. It's not the case that some of us are going to thrive and some of us are going to die. It's the case that we will either live together or die together. So that is a focusing principle that I emphasize in the book. That I think puts us in an unprecedented situation on this planet. And it can be perhaps the motivation to create that rough and ready consensus among us for solving problems like climate change. I think this is really a pivotal moment in the species' history.
And then the third one, to me, feels like the hardest. It's how do we fully mobilize our extraordinary human agency to produce that future? I know it's impossible to unpack a hefty and wonderful book, which I'm still not fully worked through, 300 pages plus.
You have a hard copy. I'm glad to see that.
But, when you think about actualization, moving from conversation and understanding one's own motives and understanding the differences and having the constructive conversation, then it gets to this final point, as you say, mobilization.
Right.
You think about the Green New Deal and big arguments, even among climate campaigners, over the role of nuclear power or not nuclear power. I see that the impediments there seem to be the biggest ones in some way, although they're all big.
Right. So mobilization is a key concept here, and I emphasize it a lot at the end of the book. This is a profoundly political challenge we face right now. So I have three components to my larger notion of companion hope. The first is honest hope, which is a hope that's grounded in a realistic assessment of the challenges we face, that doesn't engage in wishful thinking. The second is astute hope, which is hope that is strategically smart, that leverages this knowledge of how we think about the world and how other people think about the world to try to build alliances, maneuver around those groups that would be obstacles to progress. And then the third is powerful hope, which is a hope that is really focused on a vision of the future, a positive vision of the future. And I see these three things combining together in a political project. This is, profoundly a struggle between different visions of the future, different political positions, and at the heart of that are power structures and the use of power. And folks who want to make advances need to be very astute about the use of power strategically. So mobilization, when I say mobilization, I mean, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the streets, people organized politically to bring about change. We're not going to see what we need to see without that kind of action.
Right. So let's broaden things out here a little bit and bring in Susan Cox Smith, who works at articulating concrete visions to how to address a complexity and address the kinds of deep uncertainty we have around us and still get things done in the context of a goal or how to shape the goal. So Susan, when you think about those predicates that were laid out there, can we call you Tad? That's
yes, please.
Yeah. What comes to mind in the context of the work you've done? Just describe a little bit how you work and then what this makes you think.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Generally at Changeist, our main objective is to help organizations or people embrace uncertainty and to see the possibility inside that uncertainty rather than trying to mitigate all risk out of every future scenario. So oftentimes we have to work with, say, a particular organization or NGO or business and help them understand that when they put forth an official future that is supposed to be kind of a overarching mission statement for their organization that's always up and to the right, that uncertainty will happen. A pandemic will come, an earthquake will happen, climate change will not be abated, and there has to be some ability to pivot or reassess or shift what a preferable future looks like based on the uncertainties that are ahead or the realities of the present. So the pandemic is a really good example of that. Everybody kind of had their preferred future all laid out, and now almost every single preferred future is in the trash can somewhere. So we all have to start rethinking what does a preferable future look like post-COVID. One of the projects that I just completed, which I really, really enjoyed working on, was developing a convening process for the International Women's Development Agency out of Melbourne, Australia. And they needed a sort of workshop convening process where they could gather both NGOs and non-NGO, but feminist organizations to talk about what are the implications of some of these trends that we're seeing now in a post-COVID world 10 years from now, and how will they play out. But it needed to be something that they could do through facilitation themselves. Which meant having to make some really, really simple tools for them to use to think about those things in a feminist context. So oftentimes our work is most often helping people to think proactively about the future, but not to make decisions or solve the problems that they perceive, but just to consider all the possibilities that might be born out of that future.
So it's kind of and then I assume part of that is developing the capacities to handle all that. In other words, agility. I assume there's traits or capacities that you need to really navigate.
The book that we wrote is really kind of a non-expert explainer of how our process works. So it's capacity building in both a personal, team, organizational sense, because now more than ever, and when we even proposed writing this book, we said 2020 is going to be a crazy year. There's a lot that's already, on the books that we know is going to happen, the 2020 election, Brexit, and then everything else happened. So when the book was actually delayed from a July release to a September release, we were like, people really, really, really need this book. And we could actually genuinely make the case for that because, the book was postponed because of COVID. So it's,
right.
We get involved in all of these issues as well. So we like to try to feel like we can teach people how to have a futuring mindset, and that's really what the book is about. It's not an academic text on what futurists do or how they work or where these tools and processes came from. There are plenty of books out there about that. This one's just kind of a very sensible, easy to read, ground level entry book about how to think about the future.
And is there kind of a what's the first step toward that? Is there what, on the list?
The very first thing that we talk about is active sensing, and that is having an awareness of the world that isn't only what's inside your bubble. So horizon scanning is a futuring term that you will hear a lot. Active sensing is a kind of horizon scanning that people can do every day. We all do it anyway to some degree. When we wake up in the morning, I saw a tweet go by earlier. It's like you can tell what time people get up now, but based on their tweet about finding out that Trump was positive. So, but that's the first thing we do. We look at our phones, or we turn on the TV, or, turn on NPR on the radio. So that's a kind of active sensing, and that is a skill and a capacity that we really encourage people to build on and improve to give them a better sense of, what's actually out there in the world.
And that relates to Tad's, one of his pieces on his list. First, we need to identify how and why we see the world the way we do. And that's this, I'll mention Kahneman again, the lesson in his book, and in the work of others, behavioral scientists I've dug in on over the years, or people who focus on meditation, mindfulness. It's stepping back from your own reactions, your own narrative, breaking narrative, like making sure you're not stuck in a narrative seems to be like when you wake up and look at the phone and you immediately are thinking in a partisan way about Trump as opposed to what does this mean for my community, et cetera. Is that
exactly.
And
Yes.
does that resonate with you, Tad?
Yes, it does. A bunch of things resonate here, actually. It's sort of a situational awareness, maybe Susan, that you're talking about, a kind of not a somewhat more objective, realistic scanning at the horizon to see where we are in our current circumstances, as Andy is suggesting, stepping back in a somewhat more disinterested way. But the other thing I like about what I've seen of your work, Susan, in the book, but I haven't read the book yet, is that it seems to think of uncertainty as a resource, or uncertainty as a source potentially of hope. Because that the complexity of our world makes for an extraordinary range of novel possibilities in the future. And I think we're all inclined to deterministic thinking without recognizing that there are these shocks that happen. And not all of these shocks have to be bad things. Some of them can be good. And some of them we may even be able to promote and exploit in certain ways, which is the point of a new institute I founded out here in British Columbia called the Cascade Institute. And so that very complexity and that uncertainty is something that gives us possibilities for the future that are not yet expressed. And I think it sounds like what you're trying to do is to cultivate people's comfort with that and recognition that is something we have to be prepared for and potentially ready to take advantage of when the opportunities arise. And I think that's a wonderful idea. It's something that I stress in my book too.
Let's bring in Michael now too. Michael, can you just describe your background and then a little bit about future fossils? And to me, this the value of Long Now Foundation is also breaking mental models of
Yeah,
what
yeah.
time is, the 10,000 year clock, the pointing to that John Cage composition that just now has had its first change in the notes, like after like, I don't know, 20 years.
Right.
So what comes to mind as you're thinking about this, and just a little snapshot of what drives you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was trained as a vertebrate paleontologist. I was lucky enough to spend my summers as a teenager doing dinosaur expedition work in Wyoming with kind of notorious rock star paleontologist Robert Bacher,
Yeah.
whose book in the 80s, Dinosaur Heresies, was a major influence on the change in public sentiment and the narrative around prehistory and like what we were actually looking at when we look back in time. And he inspired me into a very I would say integrated way of thinking about history and the present and the future. He was rabidly against the siloing
Sorry.
of disciplines in both practice and education. And so I was definitely prepared for an affinity to the work of the Long Now Foundation when I first found that book, and they were a big influence on Future Fossils podcast, which is in part trying to hold a it's intentionally semantically ambiguous, right? Like it's yeah, we might be future fossils. It's also about the argument coming from certain branches of quantum physics that we have to abandon our current understanding of time, that looking at alternative models of time, in which, for example, we may, this is kind of far off to one side of this conversation, but in which it may be the case that there are that we're receiving information out of context from the future. And so that's neither here nor there in some sense. But listening to this conversation, one of the things that comes up for me is a talk that I heard by Michelle Gervon, who's affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute. She gave a talk for their community lecture series a while back on reservoir computing, which is using a reservoir of chaos, like a camera pointed at a bucket that's feeding data from the ripples in the bucket into the workings of a machine learning algorithm, and so it's providing noise to the output of the algorithm. And this technique has empowered researchers predicting complex systems to achieve better results than they believed were mathematically possible, longer forecasts. And when I think about just from a background in evolutionary dynamics, when I think about the future, when we're talking about the future, and Susan and talking about the preferred futures, this is the output of a cosmological model that each of us is running based on a particular training data set. The events of our lives and the way that our environments have been encoded into us and anatomically in our bodies, our cognitive biases, what we're even capable of understanding and thinking about. So, this question about embracing uncertainty, I think, is really important, because to give a shout out to Nora Bateson and her conversation around warm data, this is an encounter with the real that transcends the limitations of our models, and I think that's when people like Doug Rushkoff talk about narrative collapse, it has this kind of like anxious edge, like all of us are losing the structures culturally, socially, that we have depended on. We're going through this sort of omnidimensional legitimacy crisis right now, and so like in the midst of this epistemological free-for-all that we're in, there's hope, I think, that we can actually encounter the world a little bit more authentically, a little bit more honestly. That if we're willing to embrace the the quote unquote like VUCA, nature of things, that in a way this offers an opportunity for us to democratize certain truths that I think were until very recently kind of locked up within esoteric philosophical disciplines like Buddhism. Like it becomes incredibly obvious that Herodotus was right about, and I mean, anyway, so yeah, this is,
Yeah, I know.
it's like breaking our expectations, I think is really key here. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one other person I'll reference here too, Dan Siegel, who's a UCLA psychiatrist who's written a lot about the mind, the nature of the mind, as well as focused on the neurophysiology and the like. But he talks about us all, each of us having a we map, meaning a map of the world outside of us, and a me map, that our mind is partially both of those things. And that this gets to one of Tad's key reference points in his book. You need a bigger we map to create that potentiality that you describe in points 2 and 3. And that's, what does that say?
Heraclitus.
Put it
Not
closer.
Herodotus.
Is that from Herodotus?
He
Well,
just talks about setting the foot in the river and
Yeah. I was wondering.
change. Yeah, no. Anyway, please.
I love post-it notes like that. Someone did it. Someone did a whole PowerPoint presentation once just using post-it notes.
Yeah.
But the we map, the me map is something, but we've all described it, what I think is a key practice almost. I'm just going to show you. And for journalism, I've just thought about this for a very long time, having been stuck in one narrative on climate change, since 1988, writing my long articles.
Oh, wow.
That
I think I have a copy of that somewhere.
Yeah, maybe it's mine's tattering, but it's kind of like I use the hashtag these days, narrative capture, to avoid narrative capture. And frankly, what I think people might not recognize yet is the practical value of the practices you're outlining both in Tad's book and Susan's practice and futuring, and what Michael was just saying, which is that your narrative might be helpful in some ways, navigating, staying sane. We all need guide. We all need sort of, you're either a Krugman person or you have your choice of guides. But I don't think ultimately we want to be captured by narratives, certainly external ones and possibly internal ones. So I just want to show you that I suddenly realized one day that avoiding narrative capture is breaking free is kind of like going into an IKEA store, which has anyone not been to an IKEA store? And I've been twice, and it's always raises my blood pressure because you realize you're being led around through this path. And as you can see in this pair of tweets, do you want to be captured by the conduit leading you to slaughter, meaning, or to consumption? Or do you want to be captured by a consumptive narrative of a store? Or do you want to know how to get out? So I think that's kind of like, it sounds like that's a key trait that you're all getting at. Say no if not.
If I could intervene just for a second. So I gather you're somewhere in the middle of the bookend, but towards the end, I mean, I think we're very much on the same page, all of us here. Towards the end of the book, I provide some tools to try to create, I guess, opportunities for narrative breakout, especially in our worldviews. I have this notion of a high-dimensional state space, worldview state space, that allows us to sort of think about where we are in terms of our perspective on political systems and social possibilities, where other folks might be in terms of their perspectives, to see possible pathways through this a multidimensional state space. And the really exciting thing that this idea raises for me, I think, is the possibility that there are quite a few, and perhaps an enormous number, of perspectives on social reality that we are not even aware of. We don't even know they exist as possibilities. And to the extent that we have a representation of the full range of possibilities available to us, we can start exploring those other unexplored basins of attraction in what I call the mindscape. And we are trapped in highly destructive perspectives on the world and on each other. But at the same time, I think things like the pandemic and the high connectivity among us, the increasing frequency of shocks that are rocking the world, are offering us the possibility to flip potentially very quickly into other perspectives, large portions of humanity, perhaps in very negative directions. I talk about the Mad Max world, but also I think that there are possibilities out there that again, we haven't explored yet, that could be very positive, that could take us to new places, emphasizing this notion of shared fate on the planet that I talked about earlier.
One thing that I wanted to challenge us all with is the fact that the interpretations of the chaos around us have dimensions, have layers too. For some, the pandemic chaos is really about the economy. For others, it really is the health problem. And their solutions to those two challenges can be completely divergent. The lockdown, this is a big chunk of the debate between libertarians and liberals over COVID policy.
Right.
If you're defining the problem as economic, and that the disaster is economic, and that those larger health impacts are the key, or that we just need to get this virus under control to get the economy going again.
Right.
That's where you don't even have common frames of reference. That seems like in a multidimensional landscape, which is where we're at right now. It seems
That's
really
right.
problematic. So Susan, it would be great to get you back in on, like, if you had a libertarian and a liberal in the room, an anti-masker, but someone who's like smart and trying to, for whatever reason, just has a different interpretation of what to do, and someone who's really communitarian and says, what would you do? How do you start that ball rolling?
Well, one thing that we actually encourage a lot in our work is that any team or organization that we partner with or work for or consult with, that their teams be diverse, so that they're not only inclusive, but they are diverse, so they incorporate a lot of different points of view. Because one thing about a preferable future is you have to ask the question, right, preferable for who? And so when you're sitting in a room with people with very, very oppositional perspectives of, what the future should be, one of the things that we try to bring to the table is that, the history of futures is actually started at Rand, and it was about thermonuclear destruction. I can never say that word. And so there were a lot of different perspectives about, how to deal with that, or whether, first strike capability was the way to go. So when you talk about futures now, there is a real effort in younger futurists and our organization as well to really, really try to avoid a singularly Western perspective about how you address the situation. It's not just so much a communitarian and a libertarian. Is it a Buddhist, or is it someone who comes from a country that is being hit in a very, very different way? So it's maybe not an economic or a pandemic question. It's something else entirely. So when I think that's one part of how we try to get people to think about futures. It's not just about, what do you think, that me map, but also starting to bring in that me map idea of, but not just the we of, people who live in my town or my country, but, a much, much, much wider universe of participants, and what that preferable future looks like for those types of people.
And there was a comment that came in preceded by a line of Z's from the machinist. I don't know who it is.
Oh, there he is.
But he's saying get to the point, which we all want to do. I mean, we're still early. We have a half hour to go, and that's the transition here. I think you're actually we're all being very constructive about getting to the point right here, and which is, where do you start? I think the menu, the set of ways to approach a day or a week or the development of a company, or your approach to making for rational policy in your community, there clearly is directionality here. I do think that one of these, what you just brought up about these different states of reference, whether it's Buddhism, think of the climate talks for 30 years, which I've been writing about. where you have least developed countries, developing countries, countries that were developing and now are superpowers like China, countries like Russia that are all about petro resources, and Saudi Arabia, and the United States, which is a little bit of everything. And there was always this expectation until like 2009 that we need a contract, a binding contract. That was the treaty that was hoped for, targets and timetables. And now Paris Agreement has some of that plasticity, the ability for not necessarily Buddhists, but for different countries to come to the table with their capacities and what they can do, and it gets hammered because it's soft. It's not binding, but to me it feels like the only way forward on these. So that maybe this gets to what Tad was saying about the nature of brokenness. It was 2009 pretty much when that model broke,
Right.
for a treaty. And
Right.
there were always people talking about this. Thomas Schelling in 1991 with others was saying we need soft law, not hard treaty. No one was listening then. So maybe we'll do a quick round on the merits of brokenness. Like right now we're very broken at several scales. So do you see this? Could you articulate if that feels like an opportunity? Maybe we'll start with Michael.
Well, yeah, right at the beginning of the U.S. coronavirus closures back in March, I put out an episode of Future Fossils where I was drawing on all of the complex systems research that I've read over the years, talking about the way that systems, you got to think of like this in terms of multiple time and spatial scales, right? When you look at mass extinctions, when you look at social revolutions, one of the things that all of these have in common is that there's a kind of things reach a level of sophistication and network complexity that there are latencies inherent in the network that has grown on the basis of the economies of scale. Like if you look at the global economy, it got as big as it did because of what Brian Arthur calls increasing returns, and that episode 139. So we get these economies of scale that grow things so that we have like global just-in-time supply chains, and the internet connecting everyone's mentation, and then a challenge happens that makes it impossible for the society to respond, or the ecosystem, if you look at mass extinctions, to respond fast enough to adapt given the latencies in the system. And so things fragment. This is very common in the collapse of civilizations. You look at the Chacoan peoples here in New Mexico. SFI's Stephanie Crabtree wrote a great piece about this for the Transmission series, about how they didn't just disappear, they scattered. Actually, shout out to Annalee Newitz and her book Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, in terms of how you deal with this stuff. That there is fragmentation not only seems like a harbinger, if you look at the work of people like Miguel Fuentes, who noticed that the social graphs fragment in the expectation of a crisis. You see it in polarization now. It's like, I don't know that polarization is the problem. I think it is the global cognitive, collective cognitive process trying to, split up in and come to its, solutions from multiple different angles, because we can't enforce a common narrative anymore because the processes that require that are too slow. And so that, it's I think, stepping back a little bit, kind of taking a non-dual perspective on this, it is both anxiety inducing as well as sort of, alternatively hopeful that we're watching collective narratives come apart, and we're watching people huddle up. It reminds me of like the increase in mutation rate that we see in bacterial cultures when you shock them with environmental toxins. So it's a step into a faster, more innovative, more creative approach to thinking through this stuff, even if it is kind of more, unpleasant to be inside of it.
Yeah,
while it's
right, here we
happening.
are. Well, I remember there was a lecture given by a Cornell business professor. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name. 10 years ago that I saw where he said he was talking about chronocentrism, where every generation feels it's special,
Right.
and the greatest generation, etc. But he said this time really is special, meaning this juncture is bigger than other junctures, bigger than other challenges. So Tad is
On
broken.
brokenness.
The upside of brokenness really is what
Yeah,
you wrote about
broken
20
brokenness.
years ago.
I endorse everything that Michael just said. I'm going to take a slightly different cut at it. I think prior to the pandemic, the way I was thinking of the world, and it was one of the reasons I initiated the Cascade Institute, is that things are sort of locked up, especially when it comes to, for instance, our economic structures, trajectory of carbon emissions. We weren't. It was really hard to see where the leverage points were in the system because everything was rigid, and in terms of our economies, our worldviews, technological change, possibilities for technological change. I mean, there were some things happening, but it was very incremental. And all of a sudden, with the pandemic, it's like all the puzzle pieces are in motion simultaneously, and we're not really sure how the system's going to reconfigure itself. So there are cascades happening all over the place. It's broken in a way. There's been a shock and things have fallen apart. And there are opportunities for reconstructing this system that haven't existed in a long time. So I want to take machinist's injunction very seriously, because I think that what we have in this much more fluid situation is opportunities to get beyond that contract model you were talking about, Andy. And actually use the kind of political mobilization that I was mentioning earlier to, for instance, work through financial markets, changing the incentive structures for investments, for instance, in the fossil fuel industry, shifting enormous amounts of investment towards green energy technologies. We're on the cusp of what could be called the Minsky moment, where you have a massive shift of investment out of fossil fuel industries into in other directions, and extraordinary amounts of stranded carbon, sucking of fossil fuel wealth out of the economy. It's not necessarily going to be an easy process. It could be very destructive to existing economic models, to geopolitics. It could destabilize geopolitics around the world. But I see the political mobilization process, millions of people in the street saying we need to do something about this, perhaps led by children, as having a huge potential influence on financial markets and in turn on investment patterns for new energy technologies. And that's completely independent of the kind of contract, Paris Accord, Kyoto models that we've been working with up to this point. It could happen very fast, be highly nonlinear, and could put us really on a very different trajectory. A rocky one, but to a different future from where we seem to be going before the pandemic.
And Susan, so spinning to you on this brokenness concept and the corporate world too, which you interface with quite a bit. In all of these arenas, there's this pressure between rebuilding the broken thing and sort of pro-generation, building something new. I've done probably 10 sessions on this webcast with different folks focused on that dynamic, this tension between the pull of the existing norms and the push towards something new. And I agree that, again, young people clearly are capable of breaking those norms in a pretty powerful way, jogging things. The transparency that we now have through digital awareness, through remote sensing on bad practices and mining and whatever, gives us the potential information flow. But how does that feel when it gets to corporate behavior? And is that scalability there, do you think, or what comes to mind?
I think about brokenness always in terms of it's a feature, not a bug. We are where we are right now because the people who were in charge of making the decisions wanted it to be this way. This is how we get to Trump, and this is how we're talking history in the past. But it's the decision makers, and it's why we want to encourage everyone to think about the future, because they're going to be making decisions going forward. So when you want to, give credit to youth to have the ability to make change, they also have to have the agency to do that. And it seems very, very, very unlikely in this current climate that there will be any agency granted to anyone who wants to shift someone else's preferable future. So we need to give people hope, and we need to give them, the heart to think about things differently, to recognize the uncertainties, and to see where the implications land if this decision is made instead of that decision. And to really believe that they can find the agency and find the influence and, raise themselves up to be better positioned into building a better world that is better for more people, not fewer people.
That's there you go, and that's that dynamic. I do think, how does this relate to, again, a 20th century norm, a multi-century norm of top-down thinking for solutions versus bottom-up? What I said about the Paris Agreement versus the Framework Convention was one. But at a bigger scale, I've had conversations with sustainability folks. A guy named Heriberto Cabezas, who 5 years ago, when the Pope came to New York City to drive the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a meeting, and this guy stood up and gave a long talk about his models for getting humanity through the next 200 years. And his bottom line was, coordinated manipulation of 6 variables is necessary to navigate the next 200 years. And I'm thinking, I kind of went, hello. It doesn't sound like the world I know or the world I would want. And when I think about that, it makes me implicitly understand more about the importance of bottom up or community out or person to person connectivity, which gets discounted so often as being like on carbon. My choices are meaningless, but is there a bigger value, and this is for Tad again first maybe, to that end of things being more enabled?
I think so, but boy, we're learning some harsh lessons right now about the implications of connectivity and social media. So you may remember in the Upside of Down at the end, I sort of waxed optimistic about the possibilities for collective intelligence in humanity because of our networked reality, the noosphere, the emergence of higher order intelligence, because we could all solve these problems wired together. And I think one of the harshest lessons we've learned in the last 15 years or so, especially in the last 5, is the power of these technologies, especially when they are dominated by certain corporate interests, to produce a kind of epistemic fragmentation, to divide us into multiple communities where we don't share any common understanding of reality or fact. That is probably one of the most corrosive things that could happen to democracies. If you don't have a starting point of agreement of basic notions of reality, then you can't have the agora process in which you come together to resolve pluralistically your problems. So this is a part of the brokenness we face right now. I think, as Michael was saying before, this kind of thing creates the possibility for combinatorial innovation among these different perspectives, these fragments of the epistemic world that could create incredibly new possibilities in terms of ideas about how to live on the planet. But there seems to be so little possibility at the moment for building consensus across these communities. Yeah. And I don't know where to take this. This is an open question I leave open at the end of the book. Without some consensus, which is probably created within that broader conception of the we that Susan was talking about before, and that I emphasize in the book, a species-wide, multi-biota conception of the we on this planet. Without some consensus within that as to roughly what our desired future is, what our reality is about, then we really are lost, I think. And it's an enormous challenge for us. So the connectivity is cutting both ways right at the moment, and the social media are cutting both ways. And it's a story that's rapidly unfolding. I don't know where it's going to take us.
Yeah, like you, I was when I was doing my .Earth blog at the New York Times, which I started while I was still a reporter, 2007, right through 2012, all that upside, the upside of connectivity, had me completely convinced, as you were
Yeah.
saying, that a noosphere is there, the planet of the mind, the sort of protective capacity of a global awareness, and then it all came unraveled.
In all, yeah,
And there
absolutely.
were a few people warning me at that time, and I had my narrative capture. And then, of course, we've had the election and so many things. The
If
documentary Social Dilemma, I think, is getting at that pretty powerfully right now.
Absolutely. Now, just very 30 seconds,
Yeah,
Andy, it did not have to be this way. This is a particular manifestation of social media within a corporate context where social media are used to magnify certain kinds of emotions, especially status anxiety emotions,
right.
that divide us from each other. This is not an inevitable pathway with these technologies.
Is it too late, though? Maybe
Hard to say.
Susan, would have you dealt with this aspect of the information environment as it relates to futuring? And I'm just showing, by the way,
I
the
think
Social Dilemma, which I highly recommend.
I personally have not seen it, but I've heard a lot of interesting things about it. It's something that's interesting about the work that we do and the people that we work with, and particularly when we teach the How to Future program to non-experts, is how much everyone believes that the future equals technology.
Yeah.
And we always try to work in STEEP categories, so we do social, technological, economic, environmental, and technological. And so when we want people to talk about the future or trends or horizons or innovations, things that they see coming, they will automatically go to new technology. This will solve my problem. This will
Right.
make our world better. And we really, really have to start pulling apart this belief that future equals technology. Because in a lot of cases, particularly around climate, sometimes less technology is the answer. So are we willing to consider, what it's going to take, not just individually, but in a more global way, less technology to make the world better? Because it's a very, not sort of opposite day perspective of, what the future actually means or how we'll actually get there.
And Michael, maybe as a technology-focused communicator, blogger, and a podcaster, and I still spend most of my communication time here. I've written another book that came out recently, but I is it hopeless? Are we just playing catch up, just as those reporters who are trying to catch up constantly with Trump's 20,000 lies? Are we doomed to be playing catch up with these capacities that are just hijacking the system so powerfully?
Well, I mean, I haven't really brought this up on the call, but I run the social media for the Santa Fe Institute, and it is a very, very difficult job. It's, I was a beta tester for Google Glass, and I guess that was sort of my critical moment where I was, swept up into enthusiasm about the possibilities of augmenting my own
Sure.
perception and cognition. Thinking about characters like Manfred Max and Charles Strauss's science fiction novel Accelerando, and the way he was empowered by these tools. And that the Glass came out the summer of Edward Snowden's disclosures about the surveillance state. And everything turned, and I ended up writing this essay series on how this fit into this 500 million year old evolutionary arms race, going back at least to the evolution of the eye, and the way that it is a sort of ratcheting runaway positive feedback, what they call a red queen race, right? But these things tend to lead us over cliffs, and there are, I'm sure everyone listening to this call knows there are thresholds, carrying capacities. There's a point at which the arms race becomes so fast you fall off the treadmill, or the treadmill breaks. And I think we're looking at that. To speak to try and bundle a lot of what was just said. The revenue model of a corporation is kind of like the cosmological model of an individual person. It's based on the sensory apparatus that you have, the cognitive apparatus that you have, your ability to perceive and to respond. And right now, I think, we're looking at the incentives that have shaped the priorities of both our institutions and each of us as individuals. And when you look at it in that light, a lot of the problem, the sort of the predicament that we're in, is that people tend to they tend to want to cleave to what will keep them in a cohesive social unit,
Yeah.
rather than what is absolutely objectively true, so long as the problem is abstract, so long as the risk involved in believing a counterfactual is less than the risk of alienating everyone that you depend on socially. And so the collective action problems of things like climate change are really in part because for so many people these are still abstract phenomena, and as extreme weather events and so on start to become the norm, I think that we will see both individuals and societies and the institutions in those societies shift, because our sensory apparatus and our tools and our resources for sense making in this are changing. And that's actually one of the problems that we're having right now generally. I love giving a shout out to Jamie Stantonian, who wrote a great piece on Medium called Apocalyptic Cults and the Early Modern Information Explosion, looking at how similar this was after the advent of the printing press, and the way that people were suddenly empowered to make pamphlets. It shook things up. It challenged the narratives, and it challenged our sense of objective reality in a way that I think looking at social media is just a foreshadowing of what York University philosopher Regina Rini calls the loss of the epistemic backstop due to deep fakes. I wrote a science fiction novella a couple years ago about what happens when we lose our ability to trust our recordings. But this again, Tad, you brought up the combinatorial piece of this, and what got me interested in complex systems research in the first place was work co-authored by Martin Nowak and Natalia Komarova and David Krakauer back in the late 90s, early 2000s on the evolution of syntax, and how their model suggested that our societies got complex enough to merit so many different words that we had to learn to memorize to communicate so many different situations. It eventually became a tax on our memory, and we started making so many errors in communication that applying a combinatorial model for language rather than a syntactic model became both easier, lower burden on us individually in terms of our ability to remember everything we needed to say, and also it opened up this whole new space of possibility of being able to describe abstract
Right.
things to one another, to be able to communicate possibilities rather than, common prior. So, I actually see, in the sense that evolution seems to ratchet into more and more, diverse ecosystems over the long game. I think that having a global community at which people are sort of psychologically disposed to focus on different time scales could act, and that's just how it's going to be because of individual human psychological development. I think that that's actually going to be a good thing, and that I would urge us to push even beyond transcultural humanism and into the kind of questions that are being asked by projects like the Interspecies IO
Right.
project that Vince Cerf and Peter Gabriel, have been touting.
I want to
Right.
do a session on their work because I think it's a very interesting aspect of this. So we're kind of toward the end here. We could go a little longer. I don't have a hard stop. I don't know about you guys, but I wanted to sort of synthesize here now some next steps, including the possibility of the next step simply being a follow-up conversation. I mean, Michael, you've referenced some pretty amazing resources that I'm going to scroll back through this talk to nail down. I tweeted a couple of them, but I can't keep up, which means this is a rich landscape. And I guess like the next step for me is making sure, as was just said, I think it was Susan who said, the cultural diversity and orientation diversity around people in the conversation, and I'm sure this is in Ted's book too, is vital. And here we are, we're mostly North American. We are North American centric. We're all developed country folks. And like next Wednesday, I'm doing a session on the future of populations, but with a futurist who's in Nairobi, and she studies the youth bulge there. And I want to make sure we're kind of capturing that width as well. If we had a final sort of reiteration of a couple of things, it would be great to summarize. Tad, I guess maybe I'll show those last points, the 3 points again as a framing sort of work to do core. And Susan, if you could weigh in one last moment, that would be great too. So Tad, to achieve the goals that you lay out in the book, to command hope as you command a tool to sort of generate and pass it forward, what would be a first step beyond everyone reading your book? What does that look like? Which is fine. I think it's right here on my desk.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I wrote the book for my children, really, in response to concern about the kind of story they would tell themselves as they emerge into this world. And I think that a couple of first steps. One is, of course, very much like we've been talking about, and Susan's been emphasizing, the importance of self-understanding and other understanding, and grounding that. And I try to provide some tools, some mapping tools that anybody can use in the book to graphically represent our own emotional responses and other people's emotional responses to the challenges we're facing, to lay out this multidimensional state space of worldview possibilities. All of this is usable by any individual. I think those are enormously useful tools to increase our what I would call astute hope, our strategic awareness of our environment, so that we can be more effective in trying to get to where we want to go and changing the world. But the other thing that I think it's important for folks to realize, we tend naturally to extrapolate trends. It's just a very basic cognitive bias. We're not good at imagining nonlinearities, especially possibilities that are in what Stuart Kauffman would call the adjacent possible, that are invisible but just across the boundary. And they're just sitting there. And this is what I tell my kids, who are now just blown away by what's happening in the world. Every day there's something, that just shocks them. I tell them that this is really one of the most exciting times to be alive. It is, as you were suggesting, Andy, it is a hinge moment in human history that will determine so much else going forward. This is really a critical generation or two, and everything's on the line, and some very profound, not just technological challenges, but moral challenges, how we think about each other, what kinds of ethical principles we use to order our world are being discussed in real time right now. And it's time to get involved and get engaged and be marching in those streets to try to make a difference, or engaged with that whatever skill set you happen to have. So it's possible to have what I would call, or Ernest Becker would call, our hero story, that gives you a sense of purpose in this extraordinary time. And that's a positive reason for hope, I believe, and a starting point for moving forward.
And I think you've hit on something important too, which is not to withdraw.
To lean forward into it. That's right.
Not to lean in. There's so many people I know who've gotten off of social media. I really like a lot of Jaron Lanier's thinking, but I reject the thesis of his last book, which is turn off everything. To me, there's enough upside potential in the connectivity that we have here today, and that I've had with people around the world through this webcast, that I think we can avoid the hijacking and work to get the most out of it. The noosphere is not dead. I guess that would be my hashtag. It's the noosphere lives. And Susan, for you, what's the next step? For your futuring, what is the wish you have that people would take away?
Well, my kids are a little bit older, so they are 19 and 22, and they're both in college. And we always talk about how much they dislike having futurists as parents. because we can always tell them, well, it's going to be like this, and they're like, no, it's not. Yes, it is.
That's very funny.
So there's a lot of I told you so. But we also intentionally tried to raise our kids to be resilient. And I think that's a really, really important capacity that coming generations that are coming up now will need to be invested with and taught. And that's another reason that we wrote How to Future, because the curriculum for our How to Future workshops and the programs that we developed started at the Duke TIP program, and then moved to IED, which is a design school in Barcelona. We taught a lot in Dubai, because these are all future-focused groups, organizations, communities, generations. And we see that it really invests in all of our students this opportunity and ability to consider, how do you thread a preferable future through all this mess? And it gives people something to sort of hold on to, and a way of thinking about the future that can lead to a more positive aspect. Not all futures are perfect. No future is perfect. But if you can build this capability within yourself, there's
Well, I sure hope there
an
can
easier
be,
way
or
to
there
get there.
perhaps is a syllabus for young people for that learning. We could work on that. I'd be happy to help. The Teachers College has a Teachers
Absolutely.
College at Columbia has a sustainable futures focus now. There's a center emerging there. So that I think that feels like my takeaway right now. I'm writing down a note. After we're done, I'm going to email you and we'll follow up. There's a guy, Jeremy Zalar, who was
Great,
at the New York
sounds
Times
good.
when I was developing .earth. He was the blog architect, like how do you actually build stuff. He then went on to work in government on how do you make websites work for the taxpayers who pay for them. And he was the first guest on this show back in March 15th, on a Sunday. He said, make sure everyone says, what are they going to do? One little thing different, like tomorrow, or that can incrementally build the capacity that they're thinking about. And so that's the thing I'll do. And Michael, we can work together, Michael, as well. So it's just been great to have you all here today. Michael, why do I keep thinking of you as Galbraith? Michael Garfield, who is look him up for his podcast, Future Fossils, for his blogging at Long Now. Ted Homer-Dixon with his essential new book, Commanding Hope. And Susan Cox Smith from Changeist, a futurist, with a plan to build the capacity in everybody to actively future, to thread the needle each day. Not a needle, it's threading a needle through a very complex and evolving landscape of risk. I call it gray rhinos and black swans all around us, and they're all changing and morphing. So thank you all for being here today. I wanted to show folks a little bit about where we're headed the next couple of days. I had this all set up, and now it's all gone away. So there you go. I will, let me just take us back to the group shot here. Someday I'll master this process of being producer, tweeter, whatever. I'm Andy Revkin, again at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. This is Sustain What? It's a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, and now the great pause that's been enforced on us by the emergence of an interesting virus. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. Every few days, we're here doing another conversation. As soon as we're done, please share the link you've been watching on with friends and colleagues far and wide. This gets archived immediately, and get in touch with ideas. You can see in the information bar scrolling there distractingly at the bottom how to do that. And tune in on Sunday when I have a fantastic, Sundays are our arts and hearts, kick back from all this serious cogitation. And Jimmy Callaghan, a great Canadian songwriter who wrote the most amazing haunting song about a wildfire ever, Cold Missouri Waters will be on with several great wildfire experts and other singers and songwriters. And then next week on we'd go into more episodes of Sustain What. So thank you all really today for being here. This is thrilling. And I'd love to have you back sometime. I hope you don't think of this as a one-shot deal. The noosphere lives. There we go. Hold it up even closer. Wait, I'm gonna close out by maximizing that screen. Hold on one second.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tad. There we have it. The noosphere lives, if you choose to make it so,
Yeah.
every day. Thank you all. Okay, and
Thank
take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
See you again.